Many of the world's spiritual traditions teach surrender to God as a path to transcend the limited sense of self. Sri Ramana Maharshi fully accepted the value of this approach. In fact, he often said that surrender was just as effective as self-inquiry for realizing the truth. Traditionally, surrender is associated with devotion, prayer, worship, and a personal relationship with God. But Ramana pointed to something deeper. For him, true surrender was not simply worshiping God as someone separate from oneself. Why? Because ultimate realization comes only when the one who believes, "I am separate from God," disappears completely. According to Ramana, there are two ways to reach this state. The first is to hold firmly to the sense of I until the false individual identity dissolves into its source. The second is to surrender completely, placing all responsibility for one's life into the hands of God or the self. At first glance, these may seem like two different paths, but Ramana repeatedly emphasized that they lead to the same destination. In fact, he often said that self-inquiry and surrender are simply two names for the same process. Both aim at the same goal, the disappearance of the separate individual self. To understand surrender, we must first understand what Ramana meant by it. He said that true surrender is impossible as long as we believe ourselves to be independent individuals acting according to our own will. As long as there remains the thought, "I am the doer," surrender is incomplete. Real surrender means giving up the belief that there is a separate person who controls life. Life unfolds, the divine acts, the self alone exists. The individual ego only imagines that it is in charge. This is why Ramana considered the first method, holding on to the I thought, to be a form of surrender. When one traces the sense of I back to its source, the false identity gradually disappears. What remains is pure awareness. The self, the reality that was always present. Ramana's teachings consistently emphasized one principle: awareness of the I is the direct path to realization. Any practice that turns attention toward the source of the self can lead to liberation. Practices that do not investigate the nature of the I may calm the mind, but they do not directly reveal the self. This understanding also shaped Ramana's view of devotion and worship. He never discouraged prayer, chanting, or devotion to God. He encouraged sincere spiritual practice. Yet, he pointed out something profound. As long as there is a devotee worshiping God, there remains a sense of duality. There appears to be a worshipper and an object of worship. But in truth, God alone exists. The separation is imagined. Therefore, Ramana taught that the highest devotion is not merely worshiping God. The highest devotion is to remain as one truly is. To abide in pure being. In that state, all ideas of relationship disappear. There is no worshipper. There is no object of worship. There is only the self. Now let us look at the second form of surrender. The surrender of responsibility for one's life. This practice also aims at dissolving the ego. The seeker cultivates the understanding that there is no individual doer. Thoughts arise, actions occur, life unfolds, but there is no separate person behind them. Only the self exists. Whenever thoughts arise, such as, I want this, I am doing this, I achieved that, one gently withdraws attention from these identifications and returns to the self. This process closely resembles self-inquiry. In both practices, the aim is to isolate the ego and allow it to dissolve into its source. However, Ramana acknowledged that complete surrender is not easy. For many seekers, spontaneous surrender feels almost impossible. Because of this, he often recommended preparatory practices to strengthen devotion and quiet the mind. These practices included repeating the name of God, known as japa, meditating on the form of God, or constantly remembering the Guru. When practiced with love and sincerity, these methods gradually absorb the mind into the object of devotion. As the mind becomes absorbed in God, it loses interest in worldly distractions. The tendency to identify with thoughts weakens. The conviction grows that God alone exists. At the same time, the power of grace begins to work more deeply. Ramana often spoke of grace as the natural power of the self. As devotion deepens, grace weakens the ego's hold. The tendencies that sustain the separate self begin to dissolve. Little by little, the I, thought, loses its strength. Eventually, it becomes subtle and manageable. At that stage, a small amount of self-attention is enough to draw the mind inward. The ego temporarily sinks into the heart, the source from which it arose. Then, through repeated experiences of pure being, the mind's outward tendencies are gradually exhausted. And finally, realization occurs, not through personal effort, not through the achievement of the ego, but through the power of the self itself. The final destruction of the ego happens naturally. The separate I never rises again. Only pure awareness remains. Yet Ramana offered one final warning. Surrender must be completely free of personal motive. If one surrenders in order to gain enlightenment, if one bargains with God in hopes of obtaining something, then surrender remains incomplete. It becomes a transaction. The ego is still present, seeking a profit. True surrender asks for nothing. It expects nothing. It simply dissolves. And when the one who surrenders disappears completely, What remains is what has always been there. The self, pure being, infinite peace. This, Ramana Maharshi taught, is the true meaning of surrender to God.